word report that analyzes the principles and application of consumer-directed care in relation to one of the following population groups. So you can focus on older people, people with disability, or people who experience mental health issues. Now, if you would like, you are welcome to narrow the population down further. So, for example, focusing on people who are experiencing a particular type of mental illness, or maybe older people with dementia, for example. Just be careful when you're narrowing down your topic and make sure that you can find enough literature to support your report. So that's the one thing just to be careful of if you do want to narrow your topic down. You'll also note we have covered consumer-directed care in multiple weeks of the course, and each of these population groups has 1 week dedicated to each. So you'll be able to start with that content and then go from there. So your report must respond to the following question. How can healthcare workers use consumer-directed care to help patients and clients navigate healthcare settings in ways that support their dignity and enable self-determination? So as we move through the instructions, you will see that this question is mostly considered under the green hat, and that will make much more sense shortly. Also, just a reminder, I've mentioned it a couple of times in the course, just keep in mind the differences between person-centered care and consumer-directed care. And we have highlighted that in the content for this course, so make sure that your report is focusing on consumer-directed care. So there is some detail here about the aims of the assessment, which you can read through yourself, but you'll be able to see some key words here, such as dignity and enablement and choice, as well as autonomy. So those are some of the key words that are coming out as part of the aims of the assessment, considering those aspects. So we will be using Edward de Bono's 6 Thinking Hats framework to structure the report. So this next section contains some detail about this approach. Essentially, each differently coloured hat represents a different perspective on the situation. So it allows you to complete a comprehensive analysis. So I know many of you won't have used this before, but we've got some resources in this information page to help you understand the approach. And I actually find it really, really helpful to use this as a framework. So if I scroll down, this table here can be used as a tool to help you with planning your report, but please don't include the table in your actual final report. So just view this as a planning tool to help you. So you can see the different thinking hats here. So for example, the white hat considers the facts and just the facts, the information that is known or needed. So for example, the overview of the population and consumer-directed care services available. I'll go into a little bit more detail in a sec. The yellow hat focuses on the positives. So what are the strengths within the population and what are the positive implications of CDC for this group of people? The black hat explores risks or negatives. The red hat is your personal feelings perspective. So some of you may have come to the course with some lived experience, whether that's your own, a family member, or maybe from your work. So you can draw on those experiences under the red hat. The green hat, as I mentioned, really strongly answers that overarching question for this assessment. So it's the creative perspective, focusing on creativity, possibilities, alternatives, and new ideas. And the blue hat helps us to organize and control the thinking process. So we'll be using the blue hat for our introduction and conclusion. So this section does provide a little bit more detail about each of those hats and how you can apply them in each section of your report. So this here is the report structure. So we do recommend that you present the hats in this exact order because that will really support the flow of your report. Also, really importantly, please make sure you label each section so that we know which hat you're actually responding to. So you should actually have headings throughout your report. You can, for example, write blue hat, white hat, yellow hat, etc. as your headings throughout the report. Or in the past, some students have even put in images of the different coloured hats, and that's perfectly acceptable too. So for the blue hat as your introduction, you should be stating your target population and the focus of consumer-directed care that you've chosen to explore in the report. So, for example, if you're focusing on people with a disability, you should be introducing CDC and looking at the NDIS. We know that the NDIS is using CDC approaches. You also should be explaining the order of the hats and the process used. So you should be actually stating that you're using the Edward de Bono's 6 Thinking Hats framework to structure your report and giving some detail about that. You should also include an in-text reference for that framework. You should be articulating the approach that will be taken, explaining the emphasis of the hats. So, for example, we know that the green hat will need more detail than the other hats. So you might actually state that the green hat will take more emphasis within your report. You may take a different approach, in which case please explain that in your introduction. Then the white hat focuses on the facts. So what are some key facts around CDC? So an obvious aspect of this is actually defining consumer-directed care. What does it actually mean? You can give key facts around the population and how many people are actually accessing CDC services. So, for example, how many people with disability are accessing the NDIS, and provide some basic detail around the CDC services for your chosen population. Also, really importantly, ensure that dignity is a focus. We will go to the rubric a little bit later, and you'll see that it's really important in this section to make sure that you are focusing on dignity. Under the yellow hat, you're outlining positive aspects of CDC in relation to your chosen population group. So for example, choice is a really obvious positive aspect of consumer-directed care. We've seen that come up time and time again in the content over the weeks, but it's also important to recognize that this is subjective. So choice, while it's normally viewed as a positive, can also have some challenges come along with that too. Under the black hat, you'll be outlining any challenges that CDC may present for the patient or client and for the healthcare worker in relation to your chosen population group. So, for example, we know that CDC has a lot of complexities around it. So some people have described it as a full-time job, having CDC services and needing to understand the ins and outs of how that system actually works. So that is a challenge for some people, but for other people, that's not going to be a challenge. So again, that's recognizing that subjective element, that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and all the positives are not positives for everybody, and the negatives are not negatives for everybody. So another thing I just wanted to mention with the yellow and black hat in particular, keep in mind your chosen population group. So you can look at it from the perspective of CDC overall. What are the positives and negatives of CDC overall? But taking that upper step is actually considering the unique needs of your chosen population group. And are there any unique positives or unique challenges that are particularly relevant for your chosen population group? So that's something to think about if you are aiming for that higher grade band, is how can I really tailor this to my chosen population group? Then you have the red hat, so you're expanding on the positive and negative aspects through your own feelings and through that of others. So as I mentioned, some of you have got some lived experience. You might have experience working in the system. You may have experience being a client or a family member or a friend has. So you can speak to those experiences, obviously keeping things confidential and not sharing anything that shouldn't be shared. But this just allows you to actually explore your own perspectives and your own feelings around CDC. In this section, you can view it as more of a reflection, so you can use first person in this section. It's more reflective. And then in the green hat, this is the larger section out of all the other hats. You'll dedicate more of your word count to the green hat, most likely. And here you're actually drawing information together from the other hats to answer that overall question around how healthcare workers can use CDC to support your chosen population group to navigate the health system while maintaining dignity and self-determination. And you should be linking to theory, such as self-determination theory. So make sure that you're linking to literature around some of those key concepts that we've explored in the course. And then we come back to the blue hat to do a conclusion at the end. So that's a concluding paragraph that pulls together key elements and outcomes of your analysis and articulate any limitations or delimitations of the analysis or personal bias. So you might have found that there are gaps in the literature, or you might have some personal bias related to your lived experience or family experience. So make sure you're articulating that in the conclusion. So overall, from your report, you want someone who's not familiar with CDC or the services that are offered for that population group to be able to pick up your report and end up with a good understanding of CDC, particularly in relation to that chosen population group. You want them to be able to understand your analysis, including that balance of there are a range of positives, but there are also a range of challenges or negatives. And then, of course, you'll include a reference list at the end. So we have given a guide here of word count for each hat. So we recommend around 200 words per hat, except for the green hat where you would need around 500 words. It's okay that you might end up needing to balance that slightly differently depending on your, the specific situation, specific population you're talking about, your personal perspectives, etc. But that's just a rough guide that we have given you. Also note that you have 1,500 words plus or minus 10%. That doesn't include any diagrams, tables, legends, or the reference list, but the word count does include in-text referencing. For this assessment as well, you don't need to include a title or a contents page. That's something that's often asked for in a report, but it's not going to be needed for this assessment. And if I scroll down a little bit further, you'll also see there's a video here about the 6 Thinking Hats framework and some links around referencing too if you need those further resources. Now I'll just go to the rubric. Because as I've mentioned for this course, there is a lot more detail in the rubrics. The rubrics have very specific detail about what's needed for each grade band. So really important to go to the rubrics. So criterion 1 is the blue hat. So you're wanting to, in your introduction, explicitly identify your target population, explain the order of the hats and the process that will be used, and articulating the approach that will be taken, explaining the emphasis of the hat. So that's really identical to what was mentioned in the assessment instructions. This criterion 1 covers the blue hat in full. So the blue hat is your introduction and your conclusion. If you are aiming for that HD grade band in your conclusion, you really do need to clearly articulate possible limitations or delimitations of the analysis or personal bias. So that's what I was mentioning before, is actually in your conclusion stating some of those limitations, such as gaps in the literature, or if you have personal bias, they may have influenced your assessment or your analysis. Then criterion 2 is the white hat. So analysing key ideas and facts about consumer-directed care in relation to your nominated population group, presenting facts that could be conflicting, contested, or subjective. And you can see dignity is mentioned in all of the grade bands from pass through to high distinction. So keep that in mind, that dignity is really important to explore under the white hat. Criterion 3 is the yellow hat, so the positive aspects. And you can see in those higher grade bands, we're looking at recognizing that subjective element. So for example, the fact that choice can be viewed as a positive, but there can also be challenges related to choice. So recognizing that the positives are not always necessarily positives. And similarly for criterion 4, which is the black hat. So recognizing that subjective element if you are aiming for the higher grade band. Criterion 5 is the red hat. So you're presenting insightful reflections, incorporating CDC. So there's not as much detail in this section of the rubric because this will be quite varied depending on your personal experiences. Criterion 6 is the green hat. So there is quite a lot of detail in this section. This is the section that we recommend around 500 words being dedicated to. So there's quite a lot of detail. You want to synthesize information from the